Welcome to this ACTFL webinar, an overview to the series, Strategies to Guide Learners to Their Next Level. My name is Paul Sandrock, Director of Education at the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, ACTFL. This webinar will introduce you to the three-part series now available for purchase at our ACTFL website, www.actfl.org. In this overview webinar, the three presenters of our series are each going to provide an overview to the key content from their individual full-hour webinars. Sharing ideas and examples in this webinar are Pablo Muirhead, who started as a middle and high school Spanish teacher and is now teaching Spanish at Milwaukee Area Technical College, where he also serves as the coordinator of teacher education. Also, Alicia Dawn Samples, who is the World Languages and Partial Immersion Coordinator for Lexington School District 1 in Lexington, South Carolina, comprising 7 languages plus 5 dual immersion programs. And prior to that, Alicia Dawn taught French in elementary grades for 13 years. And Linda Zins Adams was a high school teacher of German at Archbishop Mueller High School and a consultant and leader for the Advanced Placement German courses. This webinar addresses the questions, how can I help my learners reach that next level of proficiency? So we're going to look briefly at what performance at the next level looks like, and then our presenters will share some of their classroom-tested strategies that will help learners move out of their comfort zone, that current level they are in, and stretch to grow into the next level of proficiency. And so as we start to think about what it takes to move from performance towards proficiency, just a few slides and ideas to introduce that concept. So performance, as you see in the pictures here in the illustrations, comes from the classroom. You can see it as teacher-supported and teacher-guided, whereas proficiency, that's out there in the real world. That's that authentic performance that happens that is very unpredictable, unstructured, and obviously has to roll with the punches. It may be in the marketplace, it may be in the workplace. It is unscripted for sure. So we think about, again, making this comparison and trying to think about, well, what happens in my classroom? When I assess performance, it is based on my instruction. It wouldn't be fair if it were simply out of the blue. Whereas when we assess proficiency, it does come out of the blue. It's independent of any specific instruction, any specific curriculum. Don't care how you learned, where you learned, when you learned, just what can you do. When we assess performance, we have practiced. We have worked on certain vocabulary and structures and functions. We have practiced, and now we try to apply that in a somewhat new way, but it still comes from that familiarity. Whereas in proficiency, it is fully unpredictable. It is spontaneous in that sense of not being able to be controlled in any way. So when we assess performance, it's a very familiar content, familiar context, which implies there is some teacher guidance there, whereas in proficiency, it's a very broad content and broad context. In order to be able to be rated at a particular level, I have to match the content and context for that level. And so it's important to think about, well, how do I move then from performance to proficiency? What is the bridge? And in conversation with our three presenters, we've talked a lot about it tends to be the learning environment. And as we think about that learning environment, Pablo, would you like to just share a few thoughts about what it really takes to move from the comfort and more teacher-controlled performance to that wildly unpredictable proficiency arena?
Well, thank you, Paul. It's a great overview of the webinar series we're offering this spring, and I welcome everybody to this webinar. I would just like to share that and reiterate what Paul said, which is it does get sticky. When you move from performance, which is controlled, it's edited, it's scripted often, and you move to proficiency, which I think the one adjective that we could use to describe it is spontaneous. We're never sure what's going to happen, how the person we're speaking to is going to respond, so we need to create and try to mimic those real-life exchanges in our classroom. So everything from asking students to, get up and move out of their seats and engage several people in class on maybe topics of the day, whether it's, talk to someone and find out 3 or 4 things that you have in common with them, you're never quite sure how the person's going to respond, and then there's that whole interpretive task of processing the message that you're receiving from your counterpart and then reacting to it.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask Alicia Dawn to take us a little further down that comparison and think about how we move our students from performance towards proficiency.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Pablo. One of the things that Pablo was talking about, it being kind of sticky and how, crucial the learning environment role is. I think that one of the things that's really important for us as teachers in the classroom is to make the students feel comfortable and able to take risks, and making them want to be able to use the language to share. And so one of the things that we have really tried to implement in our district to sort of scaffold and build a classroom culture and environment where kids feel comfortable taking those risks and being able to move from performance to proficiency in that unpredictable environment is a model that we call gradual release. So one of the things you see here is a graphic that sort of represents this model that we're using. Dr. Douglas Fisher and Nancy Fry have been two researchers and consultants and sort of experts in this field that we've referred to frequently, because when you use a model like this intentionally and you plan for it intentionally, the results are a little different than if it sort of happens spontaneously. And I think we as language teachers, we typically use this sort of model in the classroom anyway, but with lots of intention, you get bigger, better results. And so this type of model where the teacher models things for the class first and provides some infrastructure and building on previously learned knowledge that you can then scaffold on, and you move to the next phase of this model where the teacher does things with the student and they practice together in a safe setting where the kids can take risks, and then those risks move to the kids taking risks with each other. So you move from the teacher sort of being sort of direct instruction, teacher-centered, to the teacher and the students working together, and then the students working together with each other as they build confidence and they continue to scaffold and grow, to towards the end, they're then doing independent practice, which is where they have the opportunity to maybe move into a setting where they're using proficiency. They're in an maybe unstructured or real authentic setting where they would use language that they have practiced in that more protected, nurtured setting previously. There are different models of how this is represented. It's basically an I do, we do, you do, and in this graphic here, you can kind of see how it moves from being very teacher-centric to learner-centric. I know that many districts have a lot of 21st century initiatives where we're really working to have our classrooms become more learner-centered and to create opportunities for students to become more metacognitive about their own learning and their own proficiency and what they can do in the language, and for them to begin to have their own goal setting and understand what it is they want to be able to do with language and where they can go with that. And this model helps create a setting and a scenario in the classroom to build on those opportunities and structures. The goal being for that student to become independent and use the language in a proficiency setting. So that's sort of some of the things. This is a little preview of some of the things we're going to talk about more in the webinars.
Thank you, Alicia Dawn. That's a wonderful example of what we need to be thinking about to help move our students forward. We can't do all the work for them. And part of the other thinking that we need to keep in mind is, well, where am I looking on the horizon for my assessment? And how controlled, sort of the same idea you were talking about, how controlled is it by the teacher and how independent is it of that instructional setting? So when I think about formative assessments, it's really sharp, in focus. It's right here, right now, what I can see right in front of me on the road towards ultimate proficiency. And so it's going to be more that controlled context. It will be what is familiar to my students, what we've practiced, and at the novice level, what I've really memorized. But I need to then move it forward and go a little bit further down the road where I've kind of let you go a little bit on your own, but I can still see you, and I still know that the road has some pretty defined parameters to it. At the summative assessment, that may be at the end of my unit, it might be at the end of a semester. What is it that I'm going to be expecting you to do? And as it gets a little further out of focus, I'm less concerned about giving you the feedback that would be so specific about every detail, which happens at the formative level. Just like a coach, when you're doing the drill in practice, you're concerned about every single movement and every single muscle, and you're giving very specific feedback. But when you get closer to game day, you start to give more general kinds of feedback, and the same thing as we move from formative to summative assessments. As we look further out on the horizon, the assessments such as APPLE, the ACTFL assessment of performance toward proficiency in languages, again, it's on that same path, and it is still definitely in some controlled contexts, but what you're able to do is getting you closer to that unpredictable arena of the ultimate oral proficiency interview, writing proficiency test, way out there on the horizon. I don't know exactly when you're going to be faced with those circumstances, when you're going to be challenged to use language in a particular way, but I want you to be ready and to know that it's what we started on at those formative assessments, what I gave you feedback on at the summative, what perhaps we verified through an outside instrument such as the APPLE, and what you now finally can do way out on the horizon there in the real world, out on your own, without any teacher guidance at all. And so as we think about eventually getting to that particular goal, we need to think about what happens in our classroom, and that's here at that formative summative. And it's important that we don't treat our summatives the same as our formative. Again, there's as Alicia Dawn was saying, it's a little less teacher-controlled, it's more student-controlled, and my feedback is going to be more general than specific as well. I think those are some important things. So as we think about moving, again, towards what the learner can demonstrate in that context of that instructional setting, so here in our classrooms, whether it's a virtual or a face-to-face classroom, we need to point towards that targeted proficiency level. We want to make sure that we're keeping our eye far enough on the horizon that we know where we're going. I'm never going to be looking right at the novice mid-level, because that's pretty much where you are when you're starting. You're at the novice low, novice mid. I need to be looking ahead to the next level to say, how do I get you there? And as we think about that and moving students up further and further along that proficiency continuum, one of the things that we can think about is, well, it's the quantity and the organization of language that keeps expanding. So at that novice level, I start with those isolated words. But rather than saying, just be comfortable using isolated words, I force you to try to get them together into some words and some phrases now as you're moving more into the novice mid area. And I want you to start using some sentences, even though they may be fairly memorized and some fairly predictable patterns. At least you're starting to put some things together, and then you're starting to string them together and tell more, connect them now with some language that is going to help you be more explicit in what you're saying and show the relationships. The words like first, second, third, then, next, therefore are all great connecting words that can even help my novice learners start to move down that pathway, eventually to creating paragraphs, multiple paragraphs. Now they're really telling the story, and extended cogent discourse at the superior level, where, again, not only has the quantity and the organization of language expanded, but the universe of what I can talk about has also expanded. So to think about this particular progression and how I look to the higher level to try to bring some practiced, controlled examples into my students' daily lives, Pablo, could you give us some ideas on what's going to help our students get there?
Yes, thank you for that excellent kind of explanation of the inverted pyramid and how we help our learners move from those novice levels up to the upper levels. An acronym that helps me guide students from performance to proficiency is the following. It's keeping it real. And each letter here represents something that I take into account when I plan my lessons, when I plan my units. I want to make sure that every day, every unit, every semester, every year, all of these are reflected on a day-to-day basis. The R represents risk, and Alicia Dawn mentioned that earlier, that importance of encouraging risk-taking, and it's one of the characteristics of a strong second language learner, someone who's willing to take risks and is okay with imperfections, because we all know, we all speak a second language, that inherent upon learning a second language is making mistakes, and risks are important. The E that I want to emphasize in this next example is expression, encouraging students to speak, not just with the instructor, with the teacher, but with one another, and for that banter of conversation to flow kind of seamlessly through the classroom. The A represents action. As we know from brain research, the more movement, the more often we can give students opportunities to physically move, the more oxygen flows to their brain and the more open they become to learning. We know all of us have learned a second language, and most of us didn't just do it by being seated. So action and movement is quite important. And the L represents laughter or humor, because that helps lower anxiety, it helps create more authentic experiences, and it makes for a more inviting classroom. But what I'd like to focus on in the next slides is the E in keeping it real, expression. And this is the most common type of interaction that we see in classrooms, not just in language classrooms, but in all classrooms, not just in the United States, but across the globe, is this IRE model, the initiation, teacher-initiated discussion, asking a pointed question at a particular student. The student responds, and the teacher evaluates. The teacher might ask, ¿Qué hiciste durante el fin de semana? What did you do over the weekend? And the student responds, Fui al centro comercial con mis amigos. I went to the mall with my friends. And the teacher may be listening for content, but is perhaps more often than not listening for grammatical accuracy. They either affirm or not the student's response, and then they move on to the next student. Now, the following slide is the ideal. This is what our classrooms should look like, and this is the type of classroom that breeds itself for helping us move our students from performance to proficiency. It's where the teacher perhaps initiates, or perhaps a student initiates discussion. Somebody else responds. It doesn't necessarily have to be in any particular order. And there's follow-up. The focus is on content, the communication, the message, and there is this natural flow of conversation, and the teacher becomes decentered in the whole process. And it lends itself rather nicely to the slides that Alicia Dawn shared, where she spoke of the teacher slowly releasing control and allowing her students to use what they had learned and to become independent learners. And if we're not willing to take those risks ourselves, then it's hard to encourage our students to take risks, and then we become locked in, maybe perhaps just focusing on performance, but not building towards the bigger goal, which is proficiency. And as you can see in this table, the IRE results in less student performance, the numbing of the brain, and unnatural context. Whereas the IRF, students become responsible for their own learning, they integrate with what they're learning easier, they're more creative with the language, and they become higher functioning. So I think this ties itself rather nicely with the previous slides and our ultimate goal of moving from performance to proficiency. And now perhaps, Paul, you could share with us some examples of what this would look like at different levels.
Excellent. Thank you, Pablo. And as we look at some examples actually taken from the Proficiency Guideline website you see at the bottom of the screen, examples in that real world, far out on the horizon, no controlled context, out of the blue, someone says, oh, I need a list of school supplies. What do I need? Here's what a novice would be able to do. Remember the isolated words, maybe some phrases, but at least it's a meaningful context. Well, what do I need? They write it down, and you see the examples of the real novice. The spelling isn't perfect, and so I think back to, well, what am I doing in my classroom? Am I supplying a word bank? Am I supplying a variety of other things to help scaffold that performance, to move it up to the next level? So this is what the novice unassisted is going to be producing. And to not just let them leave there and stay there, we want to make sure that we provide the experiences that push them up to that next level, such as you see here in the intermediate. Well, there's quite a leap. Obviously, there are many steps along the way, and that's what our presenters are going to be sharing, are some of those instructional strategies to make that leap from novice into intermediate, where I now see my sentences, my string of sentences, one after the other, and again, accomplishing the task, an email requesting the meeting, and as you're reading through, again, not perfect. It may have some native language interference. It may not sound fully authentic, but the point is being made, and there's certainly more elaboration going on. And as we then push our students up to the advanced level, not only is there more content, as you see here, it's like, well, obviously that's one of the things, but it's not the only thing. It's also more important that we look at, and how is the reader or the listener, if it were spoken, being led through the content. And so there are a lot of those expressions that introduce what the person is thinking. As usual, furthermore, there's no doubt, personally, embedding descriptive phrases into it, as you see some of the highlighted phrases in the middle of the section here. So I always think about, well, in order to get my students eventually to the advanced level, let's just teach those novice level kids some of those expressions to be able to say, for example, well, on the other hand, or on the contrary, suddenly they have a really great expression that sounds novice, but they're going to use it at that sounds advanced, but they're going to use it at a novice level in just introducing some of their words and phrases. And this is how we start to move through from the novice to the intermediate to the advanced. And as you download the PowerPoint for this webinar, you will be able to look in more detail, what does it take to move from level to level to level. I'm going to call on Linda to share some examples of what she does in her class to move students from novice to intermediate, and even preview some of those advanced aspects of language. Linda?
Thank you, Paul. I was listening to Pablo's REAL acronym, and I can totally relate because I'm Moeller's third German teacher in less than 5 years. And so the first slide shows what I'm doing with my level 1, because I've been teaching over 20 years. And I look for materials, and I have a textbook that actually brought this up in level 1, and it fits perfectly with what we're doing with the kids and getting them beyond the basic structure and creating compound sentences and using the transition word therefore early on, because it connects with what we're doing at that level. This is a slide that shows a game that we did with material from the book, and Kahoot gets them up moving. I teach all boys, and it is very helpful to get them to see these connections early on and say more than just something in a basic structure with the subject-verb agreement plus the direct object. They can take two sentences and bring it together and have similar thoughts that you can see here. In the question, they had to put the sentence together where he has a French exam, therefore, and they had to look for the clue. And they get to use their devices because we're a one-to-one school, so it's very easy to do these things, and it's exciting. And it was really fun to see them doing these compound sentences and not really realizing that they were doing something that some people may think that you need to do this in the intermediate level, but you can make the connection in the novice level. So they're in their second semester, and we did this. We can see that being in a one-to-one school, the top picture shows the environment that I teach in. And so you have to have a critical eye when you're looking at material that you want to use. And a lot of what I use is authentic, but I use Langenscheid's book series because in there's authentic material already there, and then I can build off of that. And so there's nice examples of the products, the perspectives, and the practices that I want them to have from year one. Because as you're taking the students from novice level to the intermediate level, whether you're taking them to the AP level or they're going to be ready for college, they have to have that that contact with material that, a native a German speaker would have in their own country. And so, I'm constantly looking for ways to make connections. I mean, there's a little saying that I have with the kids, ein schöner runder Kreis, which means a nice round circle. So whenever we can spiral and come back to a thought or make that connection, they're getting it. And they often now, when I say that, make a snap. And so I can use a lot of technology easily. In the second picture, as we can see here, the students are using Poplet, and we were doing discussions on the election in Germany. And so they had to make a Poplet on Merkel and her opponent. And so we read an article, and they had to find, how the article brings out the characteristics of Merkel and her opponent before the election occurred. And so they were able to do sort of an associogram easily with Poplet. Where we make connections a little bit farther, getting the kids up moving, like Pablo says, the real. And this is the thing that was hard, because with the level 1 students, I'm the only teacher they know. And so getting them to take risks, learning how to express themselves early, being active and having a lot of fun, that's all they know. This group, they've had 3 different teachers, and I don't think they ever were given the opportunity to take risks. And so it's been a process to bring things out like hula hoops and getting them on the floor. And what do we have in front of us? A Venn diagram. And so we can make these connections where they read something, and this was a PSA where they had to read about how Germany is dealing with bullying, and they had to compare the 2 students that were in the article. One is the person that bullies and the other one is the victim. How are they similar and different? And so we can get an instant Venn diagram. In this series, I'm going to talk about, what I do to get the students ready for the AP exam, and it's constantly about getting them to look at culture and the language and make comparisons. If we look at this picture, we can see that they have cards in front of them. And the cards, because these students weren't given opportunities to take risks, I had to change up what I did at the intermediate level with my students that I had for years. And so by the time they got to 3rd or 4th year, they could use opinions pretty freely because they were exposed to different authentic material where they were told to look for the perspectives, to look for the viewpoints. And so with this group, knowing that they were a little nervous about taking the risk, I allowed them to have the cards with opinion statements on it. And as they had the discussion in the Socratic seminar that we see here, and they were using the article to cite from, they could look at their cards and have a sense of comfort, and then, I can state an opinion. Here's an opinion question, dump it in the card. And that way they got to participate in the conversation. These students were learning about interpersonal by being the observer. This student would be observing the student that you don't see across him, and so he's watching things like how often they speak and the mannerisms. And so we do a lot of reading and annotations, and then we get to this point where I like to call it apply the language on the fly, that ultimate risk, where they have to respond to each other. They don't know what one's going to say, and they have to be able to use the right opinion. And the cards gave them a variety of ways of expressing themselves. And so it was interesting. Some, were just using the cards, and it was just baby steps. And then others got it. They made that connection, that schöne runde Kreis that I like to talk about with the students from the beginning, that we get there in the end. And the ultimate summative for us is the AP. But it's not just about AP. It's about using the language freely, just like they would if they went to any of the German-speaking countries. Paul, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was really helpful to understand how this all plays out. And as we, again, keep in mind that idea, moving from performance, what's sort of from our classrooms, from our instructional settings, toward proficiency out in the real world, we see, again, how do we make that bridge? And I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention the Successful, Actful, Global Can-Do benchmarks, because it's a wonderful new document to help make that bridge between the two. And it does bridge those two worlds and takes us pointing towards that proficiency target. The two organizations, the State Supervisors Organization, Successful and Actful, joined together to really create a very friendly document for teachers and students. And it's based on the global benchmarks, which are mode by mode. So it's nice to understand how does this communication play out and grow through the novice level, through the intermediate level, through the advanced level, even all the way up to superior and distinguished, in the interpersonal mode, in presentational speaking or writing, and also in interpretive listening or reading. And as you think about that global benchmark, we're just going to pull this one from the interpersonal, intermediate, low. If that were my proficiency target for a particular course, what would I do day by day and unit by unit to help my students get there? Again, that scaffolding of what I do. So I want to keep in mind that particular goal right up there at the top of the page. I keep that general description in mind. And then the boldface statements give me the kind of language that I need to get my students to do, to practice, and to be able to start to do more and more independently. Those are the main indicators that you see here. Have simple conversations on a number of topics. Ask and answer. That's going to be a signal that you're moving into the intermediate. You're starting to take a little more control than the novice would. And then the checklist, the examples are exactly that, examples. And they come from the context unit by unit. So it's not required that you must check off every one of these, because another important element is to have those that you could just fill in. But as you think then, again, if this is my continuum, if this is what I'm looking to do to move along this continuum from novice into intermediate towards the advanced, keeping those proficiency goals in mind, it's important then for us to think about what are the strategies you start thinking to help learners move to that next level. So I'm just going to ask our three presenters to share, again, some ideas to help push students along this particular continuum. Alicia, Dawn, I think you're going to start us off.
Sure. It's for this particular one, I think it's especially applicable in thinking in terms of elementary students. They love, the world is all about them. After all, they are the center of the universe, and they love to talk about themselves. And typical to an elementary student's day, they often begin their classes talking about themselves and how they feel and things that they're familiar with. So these are things that are definitely age appropriate for an elementary learner to incorporate into every day. And as part of your beginning the class and giving them an ease with using that kind of language on a daily basis and building that structure. I think that story form cannot be emphasized enough, probably at any level, but especially at the elementary level. And so giving them opportunities to have, if you go back to the idea of gradual release, a teacher modeling for them the language that they want them to use that's at that novice, high, intermediate, low level perhaps, through stories, and then giving them opportunities to practice that language with each other in partner activities and activities where maybe they take language chunks on sentence strips and they reorder the story, or they fill in blanks with language they're learning on the story that is language that's relevant that they would use about themselves. It could be about your school day, or describing your family, or food that you like, or how you feel, things that would represent the way that they could express information about themselves, and then moving that into a scenario where they have to create something with language. So it moves from being very teacher-oriented, where the teacher's providing all of that language for them, to a practice with the language the teacher has given them to practice with, where they manipulate it, they feel it, they move with it, they play with it, they laugh with it, and they make a connection with it so that then it becomes theirs and they can use it to really describe themselves. That really, I think, it's part of the novice level to be able to express things about yourself moving into intermediate, but at the elementary level, that is sort of their world anyway. So it's relevant for that age child to do that kind of thing on a daily basis without having to create some context for that. It's just part of who they are and what they do. So I think I probably have the easiest one talking about this at the elementary level.
Thank you so much. And Linda, did you want to share a thought on this too?
Yeah, and I think that, the stories, that's something I do at the lower levels, but then you have to take them up a little bit higher. And so what I noticed with my students at Moeller was they needed to have contact with real things, and so I started pulling some articles and things that they could relate to. But having one-to-one, they could manipulate it easily and annotate, and so I had to teach them that skill of learning to annotate and being able to pull out and identify the viewpoints and seeing that these viewpoints in context, as far as we now have the revised world language exams for AP, and it includes culture. It's no longer just language. It's language and culture. And so in there, you have to get them to see, the perspectives of the people from the countries, where the language can be used. And so you have to get them to highlight and see this, and then from that, they can develop their own viewpoint and then use the articles that we have to kind of cipher from it and then be able to compare and contrast, defend their own viewpoints and elaborate, because the ultimate goal that we have is that, they get to think, how do people, live in another country and why do they make the decisions that they make, and this is what's going to make them more globally attuned, and that's the importance, I think, of what we do as world language teachers, not just to get them to communicate, but to think globally. And so I like that I get them to that point where they can use things like that, support and elaborate, compare and contrast, and it's authentic, it's real. And I think Pablo was going to talk a little bit more at the college level.
Well, I just want to thank you, Linda. That was fabulous, because Linda really highlights what we're all about. Language learning is knowing how, when, and why to say what to whom. And I'm really glad you hit on that cultural piece, because we can't forget about it when we're talking about moving from performance to proficiency. And I would just like to come back to what we're looking at here, the intermediate low. I can participate in conversations on a number of familiar topics using simple sentences. I can handle short social interactions in everyday situations by asking and answering simple questions. So how do we encourage this? How do we guide our students to this particular area? As Paul mentioned at the beginning, I've taught from middle school all the way to the college level where I'm currently at. And let me show you a little bit about what this has looked like in my classrooms at the middle all the way through the college levels. I had mentioned earlier that physical movement is very important. We need to look for opportunities for students to use the language, and we need to consciously incorporate proficiency-driven activities. I have had the fortune, more often than not, to have my room set up in semicircles. There have been times where there have been so many students in a small room that I've had them in rows, but I've still managed to get students to move around and circulate through the room and talk to various people so they get various responses. And the times where I haven't had the space, I've actually moved into the hallway and had students line up across from each other, and they kind of rotate with whom they're speaking. So this you can adapt to really any level, from elementary all the way to the college level. This idea of semicircles. One of the theorists that I really, whose work I really enjoy, is Bill Van Patten, and he, in his book Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen, he describes two classrooms. He juxtaposes the traditional rows with a room that could be set up in various configurations, one of them being semicircles. And he talks about how rows encourage kind of this atlas complex from the teacher, where the teacher is the purveyor of all knowledge and the students are empty receptacles, and they need to be filled in with the information, which, going back to my slide on the IRE, initiation, response, evaluation, you can see how that lends itself to kind of a row setup. Whereas the semicircles, he talks about releasing control and letting students kind of take charge of their own learning. So I will have students set up in semicircles, and those in one of the rows, perhaps in the inner row, row A, will stay seated, and those in row B will rotate, and I'll ask a question. So depending on the level, the question could be, if it's novice, what music do you like? If it's intermediate, what is your favorite artist like? Looking for more description, all the way to advanced. What was your most embarrassing experience in school? And I'll give them a certain amount of time to talk with each other on that topic, having them bounce back and forth, and then when the time is up, I'll say, switch, and then they have to rotate, talk to a new person. It's a wonderful way to create that atmosphere where students are expressing themselves, there's action, they're taking risks, and there's often laughter. And I have a short video clip. It's about 1 minute and 20 seconds long that I'd like you to watch so you can actually see this in action and hear less of me, but actually see what this looks like in the classroom. And here it is.
Ahora vamos a ir a semicírculos. ¿Okay? ¿Cuántos semicírculos tenemos en clase? After charades, we went right into an activity I called semicircles. I'd like to have my room in horseshoes. I think it's important for students not only to be able to see the teacher, but for students to see each other, because communication isn't just student-teacher, teacher-student. El primer grupo, el primer semicírculo, ustedes no se mueven, ustedes se quedan en sus asientos, ustedes van a voltearse y van a hablar con el grupo del segundo semicírculo. ¿Okay? Van a tener 30 segundos para cada persona. Cuando yo hago una pregunta, ustedes responden y tienen 30 segundos para responder por persona y después continúan. Entonces, la primera pregunta, describe tu familia. ¿Cómo es tu familia? Describe tu familia a la otra persona. ¿Listos? Empiecen.
Mi familia tiene 4 personas. Mi hermana, mi mamá y mi papá.
Once the 20-30 seconds is up, I say switch. Okay, cambia. La otra persona habla.
¿Y tú?
Yo tengo 6 personas en mi familia, 2 hermanos y una hermana. Y mi hermana me gusta mucho gimnástico y tiene una voz alta.
Cambien de personas, por favor. Cambien de persona.
I hope you enjoyed the video and you could see how it created that atmosphere where students were talking with one another and they were being encouraged to express themselves on multiple topics and to kind of flow back and forth with their classmates. So, on to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And just to give you some access to other examples of what this looks like in reality, you can go to our Apple website of this assessment and actually look at demonstrations of these various languages here. You can look at the students that are at the more novice level through the intermediate level, and just to get a sense of the kind of language, again, this now, of course, is a little further down that path, so it's a little less controlled in the content, but just again to reinforce what you've been hearing throughout this overview webinar, with the prompts on the left and then you see the responses on the right, you can see how even at the novice level, the students are responding to the prompt, they're understanding, they're engaging, and one of the things that we want to be working on is how do we help them then ask some good follow-up questions to keep the conversation going. As the language moves up to the intermediate level, again, you're looking at the prompts on the left, you're looking at the response to each one, and notice how here it is that the prompts really do build on one another a little better even than at the novice level, asking for more detail, a little more example, letting the responder then really get more involved in the conversation and back and forth. And at the advanced level, as you see here are the various prompts, again, as they flow and stay on the same topic about how you use Spanish and in your future, what you're thinking about. And the particular one, number 2, highlighted there, again, here is a response that was rated at that advanced level. And again, some of the language we talked about before, you can see that it is there. So as we wrap up, we're just going to come back to the question that we've talked about all along. And those examples from Apple might be one way that you could help your learners know what the destination is, visualize it, understand it, know what it takes to move to the next level. And I'm just going to ask for a few final reflections from our presenters as we share a summary here that perfection is not the goal. It's not the the end-all of communication, but where am I able to show partial control, and where do we need to push our learners to get full control? Obviously, as I move to higher levels, there's less confusion about what I'm saying, but the important thing is how do we engage in understanding that negotiation of meaning. And some of the key strategies that we talked about already, the elaboration, the narration, accomplishing the function, and being more spontaneous and more independent. And I'm going to let our speakers share their last comments at this point.
I think the ultimate goal is, like we said, that they have to know that they can use the language, that this is not just a course, that we have to get them to see that connection. And so, I was reading an article this morning, and it just dawned on me what we had happen in my classroom. And I was showing my students a Stundenplan, which is a schedule. And in Germany, they noticed that the students had two foreign languages on their schedule, and that led to a discussion, well, why is that, and why can't we, just have English? And you can see they're learning English in second grade, so they're going to be able to communicate with us. And, it's one of those things that, we had to turn it around and make it a learning moment. And then the article that came out today, it was in the Fairbanks, I think it was the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, and it was something that I brought to their attention that, we're behind. I mean, Arnie Duncan, they quoted as saying that fewer than 18% of Americans report speaking a language other than English, and in Europe, you have 53%. And so, you just have to bring these aha moments to their attention and say, if you become proficient in a language, you're going to become much more marketable. Whether you're going to use it on a daily basis is the fact that, you're going to have something that not the majority of Americans are going to have. And so you have to get them to see the big picture, down the road, because it is all about them, and everything's immediate, what they want to do that year, and just get through, if there is a requirement, if they're lucky to be in a state that has a requirement for 2 years. And, we had the initiative at Moeller about the 3 R's, and it's the rigor, the relevance, and the relationships. And so, we have to connect to that, and you have to make learning real and realistic, and you have to make it meaningful inside and outside. And whether you're, getting through the formative assessments that are going to lead into the summative of maybe AP, it's going to be different for each teacher, contingent upon, setting, climate, and student body. But the 21st century, we as teachers, we're the facilitators, the motivators, and learning is about these 3 R's. I fully believe in that, the rigor, the relevance, and relationships. And rigor does not mean more. It just means that, you're getting them to critically think and make that connection. Anyone else would like to comment on this?
Well, let me jump in just a real brief because I think it's been shared already. But while it's true that the more accurate that we speak, the more people will be able to understand us. But it's also clear, if you were probably to replay this entire webinar, that your wonderful presenters have probably made an error or two, and yet we were still understood. So that's what we need to take into our classrooms, and to encourage risk-taking and to encourage students to express themselves and not to expect perfection. For students to be able to communicate their message back and forth and to work towards that closer to perfection is great, but we need to create atmospheres where that is encouraged, for students to communicate and for mistakes to be not only allowed but actually encouraged, because we learn from them. So that's it for me.
I couldn't agree more. I think you two pretty much have covered it. I think we have to have our kids comfortable and willing to take risks and make mistakes. And I think, like you said, Pablo, we're not perfect, and I think we have to model that for them too. So, yes.
Thank you, all 3 of you, so much. You have definitely modeled risk-taking throughout this overview webinar, and I'm very appreciative of the expertise, the experiences that you've shared. Again, our presenters, Pablo Muirhead from Milwaukee Area Technical College, Alicia Dawn Samples from Lexington I School District in South Carolina, and Linda Zins-Adams from Archbishop Moeller High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. To learn more ideas and specific applications, please sign up for the full webinar series, where our 3 presenters will each take turns paired up, one with the other, webinars, presenting the various webinars in our series, Strategies to Guide Learners to Their Next Level. Simply go to our website, www.actful.org, and under the green tab labeled Assessment and PD, you click on Webinars, and the upcoming webinars will be before you. I'm Paul Sandrock, ACTFL Director of Education, and I thank you for learning with ACTFL, your provider of high-quality professional development focused on today's most important issues. Thank you.